I want to set up a timeline of roughly about 6 weeks. So if we look at these four buckets, VO2 max, endurance, hypertrophy, and strength, we can plot across basically a 6 week window, and each one of these is going to have a different mile marker on this plot, right? So on these 6 weeks, we're going to see different attributes depreciate at different rates, right? So
Okay.
detraining is relative to the type of stimulus that you're actually training for, right? So it's not a blanket term, which I think is a big thing to understand. So let's start with the first 2 weeks. So the first 2 weeks of detraining, what you're going to experience is an acute drop in VO2 max. So when when we get into special populations, the two that I think are most pertinent to the VO2 max conversation are going to be elite athletes and the elderly population. So elderly population, they tend to have higher exposures to VO2 max style training. That's a pretty ambiguous term. We can define that later. And you'll see a range, and there's research that suggests this. You'll see a range in depreciation of VO2 max in the first 2 weeks from 7% as high as 25%. So you could, if in 2 weeks of ceasing your activity, lose your VO2 max capacity anywhere between 7% to 25%. And we'll discuss how that range gets broken up. How would you anticipate more if you're going to be on the 25% versus the 7% end of that range? So the takeaway here is detraining VO2 max happens very acutely, right? So it's the first thing to go. It's the first training adaptation that we can really measure that starts to depreciate. So if you take, that 1-2 week vacation, or you go on a month-long honeymoon, you're going to anticipate that VO2 max is the first out the door. Now, the tricky part with this is a lot of times people just they paint this logic of easy come, easy go. The hard part about VO2 max is it's easy go, it's easy to lose, it's the quickest out the door, it needs the least amount of recurring training stimulus to be taken out of a program for it to completely go to not completely go to zero, but to start to really lose steam. And it's actually the hardest to get back, which is kind of a pain in the ass, right? So if you're a more aerobic based athlete and you're looking for that, high VO2 max, or if you're someone in the elderly population who you're trying to really keep up this side of your health and fitness, you might want to really prioritize that, right? Because you mentioned something that I think was really applicable when you talk about the Hawaii vacation, right? What does a Hawaii vacation look like when you take time off? Because if you're doing these activities like hiking and diving for hours on end, this might be sufficient enough to maintain that. And we'll talk about maintaining each relative stimulus and what type of training volume and intensity that takes a little bit later. But I think that's a really good place to revert back to. It's what does it take for you to maintain it? Because with VO2 max, and it's not like other stimulus, as we'll talk about, it's the first one to go and the hardest to get back. And if you're in the athletic end of the spectrum, these are the guys and girls that are going to lose up to 25%. And because they have so much more to lose, right? Did you ever test your VO2 max? When you were in your CrossFit days?
No, we did a half-ass kind of test when I was in college in one of my physiology labs, but I don't. It was so long ago, I don't even remember.
Now, just based off of feel, your how much more aerobically, and now's an interesting time because this is the heaviest you've ever been. How
Oh,
much more aerobically capable were you in your CrossFit days as compared to now?
infinitely, infinitely
Infinitely.
more.
Do you feel that though? You feel that difference?
Yeah, the way it manifests for me now is my heart rate in between working sets, whether it's strength or hypertrophy stuff, something where I'm going close to either muscular or technical failure. How much that skyrockets my heart rate, and then how long it takes to come back down. That's really where I can tell. And I know it's not VO2 max in that specific case, but shit, a set of 15 and 8 rest pause bilaterally loaded split squats. That's as close to VO2 max as I'm getting right now.
That's funny. So Now, so kind of VO2 max athletes biggest. So to bring in your example, you at the height of your CrossFit career, that VO2 max took a lot to attain. And it's likely now more difficult to get it back to where it was than any other training stimulus that you adapted to during CrossFit, right? So if you look at your strength, you're stronger now than you were competing in CrossFit,
Yeah.
right? You're bigger now than when you were competing. So hypertrophy, all of that, you could likely even get your endurance back to a similar level, but your peak, your VO2 max, would be really really difficult. So VO2 max, why I think it's being held in such high regard and being kind of constantly dissected in fitness podcasts and health and longevity podcasts, is because it's difficult to attain and it's very fragile in the sense that it's not going to stay with you unless you really stimulate it. So if you, for example, have a client or you yourself are going on a prolonged vacation or something like that, and you know you only have limited time, and you're someone who's like multimodal with the way that they train and they're kind of after this hybrid sort of athlete, like I won't train anything that looks like VO2 max because I don't care, right? Like it's not something I'm going to, my detraining window of what I'm looking at is like where does atrophy start to occur? Where does strength gain start to where does strength deficit start to occur? That's going to be my viewfinder of detraining. But if you're someone who's going and you like to do a little bit of cardio and a little bit of strength and train for a little bit of size, understanding that alone, being like, hey, look, I got 3 days a week I can train. It's going to be a hotel gym. I'm gone for 4 weeks. Knowing that goes, okay, prioritize your VO2 max work every time you're in the gym, right? Prioritize some sort of submaximal cardiovascular stuff to keep that high, because that'll be the thing that's hardest to get back. So that's your first thing out the door is VO2 max.